Welcome to this week's video briefing. The focus today is on global security and counter-terrorism, and I'm delighted to say that Philip Mudd is with me today. Philip is Senior Global Advisor with Analytica and draws on an extensive and long experience in the US government and security apparatus. Philip, we're going to focus first of all on Afghanistan. At the NATO summit in Chicago at the weekend, the 2014 deadline was reaffirmed. It's time for us, I think, to think a little bit about what's been achieved in a very long and expensive military and intelligence endeavor there, and also what remains to be achieved and what the situation looks like post-2014. But let's start with the first and think about some of the things that are takeaways of a kind that will please the principals who were involved in this long engagement in the country.
I think recollecting back when I went into Afghanistan with the U.S. government as a CIA officer in the fall of 2001, the goal was al-Qaida.
Sure.
And in that sense, 11, 12 years later and into 2014, that goal has been fairly successfully accomplished. That is, limited al-Qaida presence in Afghanistan, residual leadership in the tribal areas of Pakistan. The follow-on question will be, do you have capability in Afghanistan to eliminate these folks if they return, and do you have a partnership with the Pakistanis where you can keep using drones to go after the leadership in Pakistan? I think that fight's gone quite well. It's been episodic ups and downs, but quite well. The flip side of this and the end of this, though, is we didn't go in saying we have to build a new Afghanistan. In fact, when I was with the U.S. government, we were focused on avoiding nation building.
Sure.
So now we've almost come full circle and we focus less on al-Qaida and saying, how is nation building going? I think the answer to that is going to be, as we look at this at Oxford Analytica, how do we incorporate the Taliban in government? Because we've come to realize that nation building simply is not going to happen without the people who represent the will of Afghans. And some of those people are the Taliban, like it or not.
Al-Qaida has been severely damaged. Its presence there is much reduced. Its principal symbolic but also substantive leader is no more, but it's not dead either.
It's not dead for a couple of reasons. First is the folks who remain in the organization, there are quite a few left in the Pakistani tribal areas, are very committed. When you look at the history of insurgencies, political insurgencies, religious insurgencies, people who are inspired by religion tend not to go home very quickly. So I think we have to remember, despite the successes of things like the drone campaign and the elimination not only of leadership but of, in some senses, threat, that there are people who remain that if we can't rebuild the relationship with Pakistan, we'll try to reorganize al-Qaida.
Drones is a sensitive issue in the relationship with Pakistan because drones, for all the case that is powerfully made for them, also cause collateral damage and therefore political damage sometimes.
They do. I think one of the most significant things to think about with drones is not what most people talk about, which is how they're employed in military zones. It's how they're used in zones where you don't have a military option, which is why they're so popular in Pakistan. We don't have an option to go in. But I would point out just a couple things. First, they're much more precision despite the collateral damage than a conventional weapon. And second, especially for folks who say, why don't you capture these Pakistanis or Saudis or Yemenis and bring them home? We don't have access, and the Pakistanis don't have access to this area. So as a former practitioner, you got a choice. Either irritate some people and maybe initiate attacks that have damage to civilians as a consequence, or let the threat grow. If you don't have the ability to go in yourselves, you've got to make that choice. And when I was in the business, that choice wasn't very difficult to make.
Let's talk about US-Pakistan relations a little bit and thinking about the future. The terms of that relationship are going to change in some respects, but the partnership element or the desire for some sort of partnership will persist in DC, and Pakistan will need strategic depth in Afghanistan of a kind really that it's been fighting for a long time, worried as it is about India to the other side. Do we have some tempests ahead in that relationship as we sort of reconfigure the balance there?
I think tempests are inevitable. If we're looking at a future or trying to design a future where the relationship with Pakistan is stable, we're delusional. Looking at this, whether we're looking at it at Oxford or whether you're inside government looking at this. You look at history, we had great tensions when I was in government in the 80s and 90s about Pakistani support for Kashmiri militants, about the Pakistani nuclear program, about their explosion of a nuclear device. And you look down the road at the prospects that you'll have more Taliban activity in Afghanistan, certainly the Pakistanis are going to be behind that. The prospect of more military involvement in government. I mean, this is a country that's been subject to so many coups, I've lost track. So
Indeed.
you can expect that will happen down the road, but the bedrock of this will be with their nuclear program, with our residual presence in Afghanistan, with the residual al-Qaida problem in Pakistan. You can't walk away from the table. And I think that's something you've got to remember. As angry as you get, you have an option of either being there or leaving.
Fair enough. Let's talk a little bit about the displacement of al-Qaida activity beyond South Asia, and perhaps think a little bit about Yemen and possibly also about the Sahel region as well, where there's some activity and there's possibly a Nigerian connection there. But let's start with Yemen, where we had only at the start of this week a very powerful reminder of the fragility with the attack on the military parade that took place.
I think when you think about Yemen, you have a classic intelligence problem, and that is the combination of capability and intent. Surprisingly, in all the years post 9/11, with the success of the al-Qaida message and ideology worldwide, very few groups combine those two basics of capability and intent. That is the will of the leadership to attack overseas and a proven capability to get into a place like Detroit, Michigan, where they almost exploded an airliner a few years ago. So if you look at whether you're looking at Somalia, the Sahel, Indonesia, places where we've had significant terror problems, this is why Americans focus so much on Yemen. Surprisingly, the only place you've seen that constellation of capability and intent. I'd caution, though, for people who look at the escalating or escalated threat in Yemen to understand that compared to other terror problems we face, the number of people involved in the organization, the responsibility of the leadership in spreading the ideology, very limited. The number of contacts overseas, not that significant.
Training ground function for foreign nationals?
Some, but let's not compare apples and oranges.
Okay.
It's a problem because they have a limited capability to get into an airliner. It's not a problem because they're a global terrorism enterprise.
Fair enough. And let's think about the underbelly of North Africa a bit, with the Sahelian region. We've got Boko Haram on the west, stretching right through that vast, unpoliced territory to the al-Shabaab element in Somalia. Do we have a significant al-Qaeda platform here of any sort?
I don't think we do yet, but I do believe we have a significant problem. And that is simply because if you look at the drivers for violent extremism, control of territory to create safe haven where you can plan and train, ideological support from the people, classic issue in insurgency, access to weapons, especially post-Libya, ability to keep the security forces at bay, motivation when you're looking at, in the case of the U.S., the Africa Command, now you're talking about support for Nigeria. The Germans have talked about support for Nigeria. So the adversary is looking at the West saying, it's not just the Nigerian government, it's the other guys who are involved too, and so we have to go after them. And also very committed leadership. The Boko Haram leadership has very successfully and quickly manipulated the environment up there to take control of space. If you look at all those criteria, from ideology to leadership to space to weapons to motivation to attack, you have to sit there and say, you know, I don't have to wait to see an attack to know that one is going to be in the works one of these days.
Absolutely. Let's finally, Philip, talk a little bit about the way in which the intelligence and the security bureaucracies have changed in the period that you've been working with them and alongside them, because just as the world outside has changed, just as the targets have changed, just as the modus operandi have changed, they have themselves changed in a number of ways, I'm sure.
I think it's so different, the world that I entered into in 1985 at CIA and spent about 25 years there in the FBI. It's so different than when I started. You're looking at problems like the Soviet Union that were slow-moving, that required a great deal of access to specialized information, unlike, say, the Arab Spring, where a lot of the information is open, and where the responsibility for action often was not at the CIA. So you might collect information, for example, about weapons systems, but that's for the Department of Defense to deal with. Couple of significant changes, and they sort of reflect the changes we see in general life as well. Speed. The speed with which things happen. You acquire a target, for example, on a predator, and you have a limited amount of time to execute the operation against that target. The amount of data, just as in your general life, you see, the amount of data we sit on is substantially different than it was even 10 years ago. And finally, the responsibility of intelligence services not just to collect, but to act in the way that decision makers are starting to say, whether it's against piracy or against al-Qaida in Yemen or against al-Qaida in Pakistan, the folks who are collecting the intelligence also potentially the folks who are going to act on it. That's a very different paradigm than what I witnessed 20 years ago.
Philip, thanks very much. And thank you for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed this video briefing. It's just a small taste and sample of the analysis and advisory services we provide to our clients. For more information about how those services can help you, do contact us via our website. We very much look forward to hearing from you. In the meantime, goodbye.